So it's 2 minutes after 2. I suggest we start. Good afternoon again and welcome to this iGravity webinar on innovative finance with today's main topic being impact ventures. Before we start, let me remind you that this webinar will be recorded and made available on the iGravity website. My name is Lucas Can. I'm the head of advisory and partnerships at iGravity and I will be your host today. In the next 75 minutes, we will talk about impact ventures, a term that has gained some attention in the past years and raised a lot of expectations, but sometimes also suspicion. What is the definition of an impact venture? How does it work? And how are organizations dedicated to achieving social and environmental impact working with these entrepreneurial models? To answer these questions and many others, it's my pleasure to briefly introduce you to our panelists today. With me today is Tina Ruchti from the ELEA Foundation for Ethics in Globalization. After gaining broad initial experience from internships in different industries, Tina worked at Credit Suisse for the Latin American market in Zurich and Mexico City, where she engaged in various strategic and business development initiatives. Before joining ELEA in Zurich as a director in 2018, she completed an assignment as an external consultant in Nairobi from October 2017 onwards. We're also pleased to be joined by Zamir Wiget. Zamir is head of impact ventures at WWF and an experienced impact investing professional based in Zurich and originally from Kenya, where he grew up next to an important wildlife reserve. He began his career at the World Bank, where he spent 6 years working on country development strategies in a dozen countries. Before joining WWF, he was engaged in various organizations with a focus on impact investments. Last but not least, Alejandra Baigun from iGravity will complement the panel. Alejandra is an innovative finance specialist with hands-on experience in designing and implementing different mechanisms. Originally from Argentina, she has worked in the impact investing and private sector development sectors for the past 7 years with a focus on emerging markets. Having introduced our expert, it's important to mention that there is, of course, the possibility to ask them about their work and experience during this webinar. To do so, please use the Q&A box you should be able to find in the Zoom menu. Post your questions during the presentations or the Q&A with the panelists, and I will make sure to address them. Before we dive into the topic of today, for the ones who have never heard of iGravity and also for the ones who have been in touch with us, just a few sentences on ourselves. We're a company specialized in impact investment and innovative finance solutions established in March 2017, committed to accelerating the transition to a sustainable and equitable world. We work across 3 business lines, the first being advice and partnerships, the second investment solutions, and the third impact ventures. And our clients and partners include NGOs, international organizations, family offices, asset managers, foundations, and governments. That being said, Alejandra, would you mind quickly introducing our audience to our definition of impact ventures and how it fits in the world of impact investments?
Sure. Thank you, Lucas. Let's start quickly by clarifying what we mean by impact ventures. So by impact ventures, what we are thinking about early stage businesses that are trying to solve a social or environmental issue. For example, let's think about a company that I know, which is based in Cambodia and produces compostable packaging and cutlery and has a mission to reduce the pollution of single-use plastics. On the other hand, thinking about an investor's perspective, by financing companies that solve environmental or social issues and helping them grow and scale, we can align capital towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs. So now let's think about financing these impact ventures. Thanks. Impact investment seeks to deliver both a financial return as well as a social or environmental positive impact. On an investment spectrum, which many of you have probably seen before, we go from pure financial returns on one side onto pure, but not pure impact, but no financial returns on the other side on the right. So looking at this spectrum, we will be moving from traditional investment onto ESG, apologies, onto thematic investments, onto impact investing, and finally onto traditional philanthropy. So in order to achieve the SDGs, we need to move more and more capital and more investment onto the impact investment space of the spectrum. Impact investing, as we see, is in itself a range. So we can have more concessionally returns as we move on to the right, as well as more market returns as we move further to the left. Impact investing can also cover a wide range of investment instruments, which depend on the stage and needs of the impact ventures. So below we can see a few of these examples. So let's move on to the next slide. Going back to the company I mentioned before, there will be various types of supports that we need across the different stages of growth of these impact ventures. A company will need investment for scaling, but it will also need support for getting investment ready in the first place, as well as other types of investment support related to business and operational needs. This is why supporting impact ventures to scale can take many forms and shapes. So let's take a look at this chart. We can see that there might be more need for grants, technical support, and equity in the initial stages. But as companies start growing and generating revenue, we move on to loans or even start accessing more traditional investment as the company grows. Usually, impact investing has a higher focus on the startup and growth phases, which are highlighted here. And this is because when impact ventures grow and reach and pass the startup level, they start facing the lack of financing that most SMEs face, which is called the missing middle, as these companies are too small and risky for banks and traditional investors.
Thank you, Alejandra. Now, I don't want to confuse our audience, but this whole webinar series is under the roof of innovative finance. Can you briefly explain us what is meant by that and show us how innovative finance instruments can support impact ventures?
Sure. So by innovative finance, we are thinking about financial solutions to channel different sources of financing towards solving global pressing issues. So going back to our focus on impact ventures, how can we help mobilize more impact investment to support their growth? So here we see numerous tools that we can use to help increase the volume of impact investments. So first, by using different financial products such as loans or equity, we can help mobilize additional private capital. At the same time, these products might be more concessionary, more flexible, more patient, or have a higher risk tolerance than they would for traditional investors. In second place, we can use instruments that can help lower the risk of investments and attract more investors. These could be guarantees, insurance, or grants. Next and third, we can work with results and policy-based finance. So to briefly explain, these are structures where donors make payments when certain results are achieved, and then investment is needed to finance or provide the working capital for these companies or projects that will achieve those results. For example, we can think about impact bonds or social impact incentives. And finally, I also wanted to add the recent importance of technology-enabled solutions, as these help channel investments into impact ventures. Here we can think about crowdfunding, investment platforms, or even cryptocurrencies. So looking at all these different tools, I want to challenge you to think about new ways of supporting impact ventures, both through direct impact investing into these ventures, as well as other ways of mobilizing more impact investment as well. Thanks, Lucas.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. Now that we have set the ground, I'm eager to hear more from our other experts on the panel. I will now ask Zamir from WWF Impact Ventures to present what he and his team are doing to achieve environmental impact by applying entrepreneurial solutions. Zamir, would you mind presenting us your programs and how you got there?
Thanks, Lucas. I'm pleased to be here, pleased to share some thoughts around this exciting topic, and also to describe what we're doing as Impact Ventures at WWF, some of which may be new to some of you because a lot of what we have done in the past has been to support some of this work across the WWF network. But maybe I can start at the beginning, Lucas, on the next slide and explain our journey and evolution to today. So Impact Ventures as a program began actually in 2013. It was started by WWF Switzerland, and the goal was to establish an innovation program to encourage entrepreneurship, maybe incubation of solutions across the WWF network. And there was, and there is precedent for this sort of an activity where WWF as an organization has been successful in introducing income generating elements to some of its work, but also in creating spin-outs that have gone on to be standalone organizations. And so that was very much this incubation origin of the program. That very quickly in the next years developed and formalized into what's now quite a traditional acceleration program, where we were running annual cohorts to find businesses from around the world with environmental relevance. So it's really cast really a broad net and asking basic question about what these kind of businesses, sort of what a conservation business can be. Is there such a thing as a conservation business? Is it an oxymoron? What do they look like? What kind of support do they need? And those cohorts were running for 4 years, and we had actually hundreds of businesses that came to us. About 50 went through the process, went through this acceleration program and graduated. The next part and the next function, I think the most innovative part of this package for an NGO like ourselves was the invest piece that came, I think, 2 years on into the program, where again, led by WWF Switzerland, but other WWFs in the network, we chose to invest directly into these companies. And more than that, the goal was to be able to catalyze others to invest, because WWF is not a natural investor. And so that was really a key thing. Can we give these companies the support and visibility and credibility required to attract investment, not just from us, but from others? So we invested into a portfolio, but more importantly, we had a really neat 5-to-1 leverage there, where we had about 5 times, or actually, frankly, it's more than 5 times more capital going alongside us into these companies. And that was the invest piece of Impact Ventures. We're currently in the second phase, where we're taking now evolved approach. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first is, over these past years, there have been a lot of similar activities cropping up around the world, across the network, on the ground, closer to the ground. I could point to acceleration as a function that's now well defined. There's an industry of accelerators. They all know what they're doing. They know the local companies better than we do. So there's really no need for us to play this acceleration role sitting here in Zurich. The second thing is on the limitations, I guess, in our function as an investor, where obviously we don't have large amount of assets to invest. And maybe we'll discuss later, I hope we do, what the follow-on interventions are when ventures are successful, because there are challenges in that in terms of follow-on finance required. So clearly that's not a role for us to play. The role that we foresee going forward is to catalyze things in a different way, one around the structuring of solutions where there's pooled capital going into ventures. Secondly, on biodiversity impact measurement. So we focus now very strongly on providing this as a value both to ventures and to other partners that are looking to work in this area. Thirdly, to shine a light, or keep shining a light on these kind of companies to make sure that they're visible. So we maintain a pool of what we call biodiversity pioneers. I'll get into more detail there later. And then finally, related to the acceleration and activities close to the ground, how can we support, through capacity building of our local offices, their ability to find ventures, to support them, to invest in them, and to grow them over time? So this is kind of a different phase that we've begun, I think, close to 2 years ago. But I'm happy to speak about each one of these phases because I feel like we've gone on a journey and we've touched on many points of relevance for those of you interested in impact ventures in terms of financial and non-financial support.
Thank you, Zamir, for this introduction. Now, I'm sure the audience is eager to hear some more details of some examples. Can you highlight some of them?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. It's difficult, given the breadth of what we do, to pull out examples that everyone will find interesting. But I thought about a few, maybe on the next slide, just perhaps not this slide, Lucas, but I can start here. In terms of what is a typical venture, what is a typical conservation business, there really isn't one given the sectors that we cover, but one can think of a venture like this. This is a company in our portfolio that we invested in called Activa, which is really a high case for us. It's a high case because the company really knows what impact means. And secondly, from the point of view of conservation, there's a massive impact, a massive area that it has kind of an influence over. So this is a company that is producing cosmetics that are developed from a type of nut that is sustainably harvested, in that you don't have to cut down the trees. And the output here is a high quality, high cost cosmetic product. So this narrative and this type of business is one I imagine many will think of when they think of conservation or typical agroforestry business, certainly. So the value we provide for a company like this is very much on the marketing business development side, where they are experts on impact and on the ground and measuring impact and taking care of, frankly, thousands of stakeholders. They need a lot of advice and actually financial support. So that's kind of one typology of a company that we support. And then the next slide, maybe we come back to this, Lucas. The next slide should be exactly. So this is now for an opposite example. Now, this is in the world of aquaculture, which really is an area we look, specifically seaweed and algae, that we look at increasingly for the biodiversity benefits that it offers. It's a fascinating field. But here we have an opposite example to the one I showed before, in that this is a already profitable company. It's still an early stage venture, but it really, I mean, the profitability of this is huge in what it does, but it doesn't really know and understand its impact. So this is a company that takes waste streams. It's a beautiful case, actually. It's taking wastewater streams from industry, and this is food industry, so it's food grade in a way waste, and it's transforming that into another edible product. It's a type of edible algae or seaweed. And so it's using the waste stream that would normally be discharged as, higher temperature water and wastewater into a bay. And it's basically getting the input for free and producing a high-end product out of it. What this company wants to understand is, what is the biodiversity impact its operation is having? It knows what it's doing on the business side. It's a replicable case. It's very interesting. But they come to us, and a lot of companies like this come to us saying that we know that we're improving the water quality. We know that the marine life is better for it. How do we calculate that? So here, the value that we provide as a venture program is different. It's certainly not finance, although that can be part of it, but it's definitely on the biodiversity measurement side. I think next slide, Lucas, or in fact, it was a previous one before. Just quickly, in terms of acceleration, this is the last accelerator program that we ran. This is perhaps the worst time to join an accelerator program, end of 2019, starting in 2020, really, as a new business. I mean, obviously they didn't start, so I really feel quite badly for this cohort here. But in terms of acceleration, what we do is we shine a light on very difficult problems. I know the picture may be attractive, but in fact, it's a really difficult conservation problem. We have the need to establish a marine protected area here in Greece. The need to do it is because this area has hosts one of the world's most endangered mammals. There are only 60 of these seals left. And there needs to be a business case developed for it. Otherwise, the marine protected area will not be sustainable. And so if we don't shine a light here on business development or new thinking around problems like this, they don't occur naturally and they won't happen by themselves. So just to give a bit of flavor around some of the acceleration we've done in the past. And then maybe skipping forward 2 slides. Well, here we are in our current phase. I mentioned it already in passing, but the big difference between what we've done in the first phase and currently now is that we focus very deliberately on biodiversity. In the past, as I mentioned, the ventures had to have some environmental impact, but here, with all the exigency around biodiversity, I don't show any of the statistics, you will know them. I mean, the declines are horrific. We really need to shorten the distance between these businesses and the impact they're having on the ground. So we've spent about 2 years now looking from the ground up, what kind of businesses, what kind of venture activities can we support in these sensitive areas that cannot harm, but could also benefit the biodiversity around them. And so we have these sectors of focus now in agroforestry, agriculture, regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and forestry and ecotourism. And what's been very positive is that in these past 2 years, we found many cases. We have over 700 now of companies that we can say are actually biodiversity neutral and potentially biodiversity positive. The next slide is just the last thing I will say on this point in terms of our focus. We're doubling down on technology. We started looking at this, as everybody has done. We started looking at baskets of technology that we think we could invest in systematically that would help our company. So we first looked at enabling technologies, examples here in terms of maybe monitoring tech, greater visibility. You will think of drones maybe right off the top of your head, as we did. The cost and application, the cost has dropped tremendously. Of course, our potential applications are innumerable. That's the first set that we looked at. But then we began to ask, as many others also have asked, what about impact technologies? And we call this technology for biodiversity. This is a focus that we have now that we're looking at developing pipeline for. These are ventures that have biodiversity impact as part of their intentionality. So it's part of their DNA, but they're technology companies. And this is fascinating. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think that it's more than half of any venture set up now should be looking at technology. It may be an obvious point, but how to do that systematically and how to do that if you're an NGO like us is the question that we're trying to answer.
Thank you so much, Zamir. I also heard you have something really exciting in the pipeline, a fund, a potential fund. You have been working quite some time. Are you allowed to share some details here?
Absolutely. I can share maybe the broad brushstrokes here. The next evolution in terms of how we're working, as I mentioned, is to scale finance going to the ventures. And this is the first time we act in this capacity as WWF, in the sense that we act here as an impact advisor to a fund manager for a new fund that we're calling Genesis. It's a biodiversity venture fund. And what it brings together in a novel way are those two streams that I just described, in that the fund will invest in tech for biodiversity, and it will also invest in place-based companies. You can think of an eco-lodge, you can think of the agroforestry example that I provided, both in the same fund. The two common denominators are, number one is the adoption of technology. Whether you're an agribusiness, whether you're in the marine space, you need to be willing to adopt technology going forward. And the second common denominator is on the measurement side. What does it mean to be a biodiversity venture? How can you measure it? How can you compare it? Of course, that's fraught with difficulty, but we will be providing there, I think, value to the impact investing space in the methodology and the framework that we set up as a public good to do this. So it's a difficult challenge, but I think it's the same as the considerations around the carbon accounting and how that space was maybe 10 years ago. I think the time for biodiversity has come. If we don't measure it, it'll be gone before we can measure it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. There are already a lot of questions coming in. I'll just pick one for you, Zamir, from Manuel. He's generally asking, how is the WWF Impact Ventures funded? Is general donation going to impact ventures, or do you work with philanthropists? Maybe you can have a few words on that.
So the program is funded out of the discretionary funds where I'm sitting of WWF Switzerland, so unrestricted funds of WWF Switzerland. And in the case of investments, this was pulled together from various offices, also from unrestricted funding.
Thank you. So yeah, I think it's awesome. We are really looking forward to the launch of the Biodiversity Venture Fund. Thank you so much, Zamir. I'm looking forward to some more inputs from you later on. Now let's move on to Tina from the ELEA Foundation for Ethics in Globalization. Tina, thank you so much for being with us. Could you also briefly introduce the work of ELEA and how you apply entrepreneurial approaches to achieve social impact?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and very happy to tell everyone a bit more of about ELEA and how we work. So maybe you can already go to the next slide. So what is our purpose, or what is philanthropic impact investing, and what do we do? So ELEA exists to fight absolute poverty with entrepreneurial means. And what does that mean? We actually invest in impact ventures, impact companies that through their activity improve the livelihood of people living at the bottom of the pyramid. So we actually search for innovative models that create substantial impact on the ground, and we help them grow and scale by, on the one hand, investing capital, but on the other hand, also investing expertise and knowledge, which is really important, as also Zamir has already mentioned. In order to do that, we deploy philanthropic capital from individuals, organizations, and sometimes also other foundations. And of course, we also want to make contributions, or we want to make a difference in the field of philanthropic impact investing, because it's actually not so developed yet, and there's still a lot of learnings to be shared. And part of our mission is also to develop towards the entrepreneurial philanthropy in general, towards creating or developing the ecosystem. So maybe I can actually also, because we made a lot of examples, and I think that also helps to understand a bit better what we mean by impact ventures. I picked an example that you might all relate to a bit, because I'm pretty sure all of you had one or at least, or several coffees already today. But as you know, only very little of that cup of coffee, or the price you paid for it, actually ends up at the farmer. And still, actually, the largest majority of these farmers are small-scale farmers living in poverty, because they only have very small plots, very limited skills and knowledge, and I generally face a lot of logistical and other challenges to access the global markets. And at the end of the day, they don't receive actually a fair remuneration for their coffee they sell. So Coffee Circle, the impact venture we invested in 2013, they buy high quality coffee beans directly from farmers in remote areas in Ethiopia, and actually now across the globe, and sell the coffee through their online channel in German-speaking Europe. Additionally, they invest €1 for every kilo they sell into the coffee supply chain in order to help the farmer to further increase yield and quality, and at the end even get a better price in the future. And I think turning basically from the vicious circle into a virtuous circle. And I really like this example because an anecdote from Coffee Circle is that originally when they started to work with these Ethiopian farmers, one farmer, he had worked for years, and his whole family has worked with coffee, but he has never tasted his own coffee, because in Ethiopia mostly green coffee is getting exported. So really knowing about their quality is really important, and has before not been done. And so yeah, this is just an example for one of our portfolio companies. And yeah, we have invested, as I said, in 2013, and I think last year, yes, they sourced from over 25,000 farmers across the globe. So this just as an example for what we mean by impact venture in an ELEA context.
Thank you, Tina. I think examples are always very helpful. Now, Alejandra in the introduction has touched upon the various instruments in innovative finance. And I'm curious to hear, what financial instruments does ELEA apply, and with whom do you partner? Yep,
sure. We have actually seen a similar slide from Alejandra before, giving a bit of an even broader perspective of the whole landscape. And I wanted to show that just where from basically venture or impact venture value chain perspective, where does it start? So we've heard it starts with the idea incubation phase where, you know, mostly pilots are done, but there's no proof of concept and probability of success is still very low. And I mean, there you get mostly grants, some competition money, or you know, how you call it, friends, fool, and families. But then once you really start to have your model proven and there's some track record and basically the basics are in place to grow, the venture starts to enter the space of philanthropic impact investing, where we are active. Of course, in that stage, the risks are still very, very high, but chances of that the model actually works increases significantly. And what is still important in that phase is that besides capital, there's still a lot of need for support in building and growing the organization, as also Zamir mentioned before. So in that space, ticket sizes are still relatively low, but because of what I mentioned, transactions costs are very high, and therefore this space is not very attractive for more commercially oriented investor. I think this space is still less developed than the others too, but there are obviously other players, for example, Mercy Corps Venture Fund, which is a very prominent one, and we have also done various co-investments with them. And yes, finally, the idea is that the next step is basically to enter the more commercially oriented impact investor space, for example, leapfrog investments or PG impact investments, where obviously there's also higher ticket sizes and a bit less risk basically, and higher success probabilities. And we personally, maybe to answer your question a bit more specifically, I mean, we invest in grants, loans, equity, and all basically the different formats in between. So we're actually quite flexible and adapt mostly also to our venture partners what's needed most.
Thanks. Interesting. Now, I mean, I assume it's very difficult to find these coffee farmers in Ethiopia. It's not something you can just Google. Can you share some insights how ELEA finds investable but also impactful ventures and enterprises?
Sure. So as I said, transaction costs are really high, and we do invest significant time in supporting and doing capacity building. So we want to make sure that we select the best one, or basically the ones that really can achieve long-term profitability and therefore also long-term impact. So our process starts with the sourcing part. We review actually now almost 1,000 ventures every year, and we receive pipelines through our network on the ground, partners, but also sometimes really simple desk research. Pre-COVID, now it's not so much the case anymore. We used to do scouting tours where we spend 1 or 2 weeks in a certain country and try to meet as many ventures and organizations on the ground as possible. And this also helped a lot to increase pipeline and to give us a good grasp of what's going on in the country itself. Out of that first pipeline, we screen them according to our investment criteria. We have 4 different investment topics. I didn't go into details. If you have time, happy to do so. But yeah, we look at the business model, the market, so overall screening whether it fits in our investment focus. And then basically the ones we like most and we really see a lot of potential, we start a detailed and thorough due diligence process where we really go into details into the financials, the market. We really also look at the entrepreneur, which is a really, really important part of a venture success. So this process can take quite a lot of time, so 3 to 6 months. Another factor why transaction costs are in fact relatively high. And yes, at the end, we make around 5 investments per year. And then basically the real journey just starts, because then our partnership starts, and it takes 5, 7, or actually, to be honest, even more years, where we partner with our ventures and hope that they achieved or they at some point get to the commercial impact capital market, where we as Alea then exit, and where also other players probably add much more value at that point.
Thank you, Tina. Actually, there is a question on more details on the investment process in the chat from Stefan. He asked, do you also look at the ownership structure of the enterprise, cooperative employee participation? I guess you do, but also how important is this in your investment process?
It is important because at the end, as I said, the entrepreneur is at the center of it. You know, I mean, an entrepreneur dedicates his life towards it. It's a very bumpy road. I might talk about this a bit later as well, but it's a long, very difficult journey. And you have a committed entrepreneur with a big vision, and a lot of ambition behind it is really important. And that also means, in a way, that he needs to, you know, own the company, and he needs to have an incentive to work for it. And for us, Alea, we really make sure that the entrepreneur keeps the majority, or we hopefully keeps the majority of ownership. And that influences a lot of different topics, right? Valuation and things like ticket size and money you can raise, etc. But it's definitely an important point we also look at during due diligence. And as Alea, our philosophy is not to take a majority of any investments we do.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Tina, for your input. Now we are moving on to questions and answers with our panelists. Remember, if you haven't done it yet, there's still time to address your questions through the Q&A box in the Zoom menu. Zamir, let me kick off the discussion with you. WWF Impact Ventures is relatively new, as you explained. And during our pre-conversation of this webinar, you mentioned how much you appreciate the work of Alea and their approach. Can you tell us why and what makes the Alea way special in your eyes?
Thanks. I do genuinely think it's a good model, and I thought about why prior to this, and I think I have kind of three reasons as I see it from the outside. Firstly, I think Alea, as has just been shown, I mean, it's obviously highly selective in the choice of investee, but once selected, I think they find a very long-term and patient partner. I think that's key, you know, as you alluded to just now, Tina. I think that you're in it for the long haul once you found an entrepreneur that you like. And I think I've heard the same from some of your investees. And second point is that it's, as an organization, flexible in its support and the instruments you've just seen that can be deployed, which I wouldn't recommend to most to do. But in the case of Alea, they have the right capacity in-house to do so. So I think that they're able to cover the spread, whereas for most, combining all these things would be a stretch. But most important is the impact measurement methodology, for sure. As I understand it, when I looked at it, I mean, you're scoring, you have your own internal score for these ventures that allows you to compare them across the spread of things that you cover. I think that's very important. That's something that we aspire to do with the biodiversity work now. But I think most important is that Alea looks at the value that it can provide the investee and assesses that over time. And secondly, it looks at the value beyond the usual metrics. I mean, usual metrics are return on investment or revenue and number of beneficiaries. I think Alea looks beyond that to the real value, or more holistically, the value that the venture is generating. And that's something that we do too. I give maybe an example here. I think everybody knows, let's say, M-Pesa or M-Copa, at least I think most do it in our world. In the energy space, M-Copa has still under 1 million users. So that's kind of a drop in the ocean. I mean, it's great, but it's still a drop in the ocean, but everybody knows it, and it spawned an industry. So how do you measure that? You know, that's the real value of that venture. It will grow over time to be even bigger, but that's a key part of the function of a venture program and of these ventures. It's scaled through inspiration and scaled through replication. And that's important to capture. I think Alea does that systematically. We will do that going forward. We look for these role model businesses. We call them lighthouse or catalytic cases. And that's the value we hope to provide through our program, is things that others can copy.
Thank you, Zamir. Tina, I hope you're not too red after this hymn of praise.
I am actually. I feel really flattered. Thanks, Samir, for that really good pitch of our work.
But now, Tina, I'm asking you, to take what Zamir said, but also being very self-critical, and maybe from a scale from 1 to 10, how successful would you rate Elea's attempts to effectively achieve impact through entrepreneurship? And I assume it's not a 10. What is needed to achieve the next level?
I thought we said no tough questions here. No, I mean, really, I think it is a tough question. And I mean, as you can see, we spent significant time in the selection process. And to be honest, the really failure rate, or let's say the going bankrupt scenario, is still luckily very low. But having said that, I think the timelines are extremely long, and you need to be prepared for at least one, if not two or more major crises along this way, of these 5, 7 or more years. And it is a very bumpy road. So it's difficult to say it's successful or not, because you need to be very, very patient, or you need to have very, very patient capital and very hands-on investors here. And I think just that the COVID crisis right now has proven again that you really need to have committed investors on board that are aligned and actually have that patience. And if you, in that time, I mean, it can throw you back 1 or 2 years or even more, such a crisis. So if you as an investor need to exit in a year or two, I mean, that's just really, really difficult. So yeah, I think there's definitely more things to improve. So on the one hand side, for example, I think more collaboration between like-minded investors, I think could be very helpful and increases a bit our effectiveness on both the investor side, but also is helpful for the investees. So on the other hand, I also see a lot more levers or things we can do to help our entrepreneurs, so that there is more collaboration or support between the entrepreneurs, because I think this crisis really has taken a toll on our entrepreneurs. I mean, it generally takes a huge commitment, but this crisis has strained a lot of our entrepreneurs emotionally and taken a lot of energy. And I think that's eventually also what prevents a venture from failing. If the entrepreneurs cannot continue, it's really hard to move forward. So I think, so to sum up, I think 2 things. On the one hand side, I think we can improve and should improve more on the collaboration and coordination between aligned investors. And on the other side, really creating a community or space for entrepreneurs that they can mutually support each other, things that sometimes as an investor you can't do equally good. And yeah, I think these are the 2 things that are on our bucket list to get to the next level and even be more successful.
So getting from a 7 to an 8 or so.
Yeah, no, I think so. Yeah, we definitely, I mean, you can never say you're at the 10, because there is no 10 in this space, but we're that's our goal. We're getting there.
Thanks. But Gina, you raised an important point. Zamir, the ongoing pandemic and the crisis, you also urged us to talk about that. What do you think will be the implications for your work, but also for the sector in general?
Yeah, so there's obviously profound implications at different levels. I mean, we're looking at tourism as one of our verticals, ecotourism. So obviously there's a lot of businesses, companies going out of business there. I mean, that's been devastating. So the environmental impact in these areas has also been immediate, with loss of livelihoods leading to, formerly, destructive practices reemerging, poaching, illegal fishing, logging, things like that. And that itself will take some time to recover. So positives, though, I would draw positives here in terms of, one, on our side at least, acknowledgement of the importance of nature. I mean, there's been a lot of interest now, more interest in our work. another positive is just as an organization that we're distributed and we're able to continue our work because we're in 100 countries. I think that makes us unique. So I think that that's been a positive thing that I pull out of it. But I think common to us all is, what does technology mean going forward? You know, I don't think we're going back to anything. And in terms of an investment process or investment management, what are the implications there? So there are a couple of things there to think about. I think you can't obviously replace a site visit from a due diligence point or from point of view of monitoring, but a lot of the other steps can be adopted by or taken away and taken up by technology. I think things have changed there for the better, frankly. I think things that would normally have been postponed to a physical meeting now happen virtually. So that's a positive. But I think the biggest positive from the last year has been the response of these entrepreneurs. I think they've been really resilient in the face of these challenges, and they haven't changed course. They haven't changed what they're doing. In fact, I thought of 3 examples just to make, and this makes our space special, I would suggest, this resilience and this kind of determination, which I don't think you find in other spaces. I think the company I showed before, the one in Bolivia, that cosmetics company repurposed its lines. It produces now hand sanitizer just to keep people employed. I mean, just to keep them all going. That's what they do now. We have a plantation company that did food distribution for their seasonal workers. We were looking at investment in an eco-lodge in 2019, really a great one. In 2020, that guy comes back together with his former competitors in a consortium, just so that the whole island that they work on can stay afloat. And in return for sort of a bundled investment into all those companies, all the companies would sign up to a post-COVID sustainability manifesto, which, by the way, would mean that his larger competitors would have to close some of the rooms, So I mean, that's really some positives I draw out of this. And I think that as we pause now, maybe one could consider, what things should look like in a positive way going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree what you said. There's not so much to add from my side, but I think one important aspect you mentioned is the poverty aspect, right? I think we have made certain progress in the last years, but we know that I think the whole development work of the last year has probably been thrown back 10 years or more through this crisis, and there will be millions falling back into the poverty or below the poverty gap that just made it, before the crisis. And I think that means there's still so much need. So much need for our work, but generally it's how can I say? I think it's definitely something we have to work on and makes our work even more important. And the other point I wanted to make is what you said about the whole reimagination phase and the innovation that comes out of this phase. And we also noticed that in our portfolio companies, because at the end, all of them were hit, some more severely than others. I mean, you've mentioned the tourism space. In our case, it was our vocational training or education space that obviously having a face-to-face model really suffered from the lockdown. But many of them now, after this basically first survival phase and then slowly building up resilience and going into the rebound phase, they now are a year after the crisis really in this reimagination phase. And sometimes, or that process, happened surprisingly quickly. So digitalization of certain programs and things that happened really quickly. And a lot of innovation that you would think was not possible before that. So I share the view that, yeah, a lot of negative things, but also some positives out of this crisis. And definitely a huge need for our work.
Yeah, it's bad and good news at the same time. Maybe we can go to one of the questions coming from the audience. We talked about it with Tina, but Zamir, Sarah asked you specifically if you could give some examples of investment instruments you use that other typical VCs don't, if there are any, or is it the same set of instruments?
Well, we used primarily 2: simple debt and equity. Early on, I think before my time, there was some experiments made with what's called the variable payment obligations, and that is where your repayment is based on certain milestones. For example, if the company is not is not profitable, or depending on a revenue target, that repayments would start or be tied to that. So that was one exceptional, out of the ordinary instrument that, in my opinion, I would recommend. I mean, I'm definitely in favor of tailoring instruments and having a spread of instruments, but I think there are complexities with that last one, which made it one that I wouldn't recommend unless you're going to be planning to do it over and over again, and unless you're going to be working with a similar type of business.
Thank you. And in the chat there also have been a lot of questions on performance. I think we have talked a lot about impact. But it's not pure philanthropy we're talking, so there are return expectations to some extent. Before we go to Tina and Zamir, maybe Alejandra, can you tell us in general, what are the return expectations of investors engaging in such models?
Sure. So because, as I explained before, the sector has a myriad of instruments, types of funds. I will give a very general average from the Global Impact Investing Network. So in terms of private debt, it's around maybe an 8 to 10% for market rate seeking impact investors. While it's more of a 7.5% for below market rate seeking investors. And if we move on to private equity, rates are a bit higher. So for investors seeking market rate returns, it's a 17%. And for investors seeking below market rate returns, it's around 10.5%. But as I said, this is an industry average. So I hope it's indicative, but obviously it varies case by case, and it depends on the investor and the vehicle and also the investees.
Thank you, Alejandra. Now let's take some cases. Zamir, can you deliver that, or how do we need to put this in context with what you are doing?
I'm not going to answer that because I don't think we can't compare. We can't compare when we don't have. Let me put it this way: we have apples, oranges, and bananas in a basket, And so I won't give a sensible answer there. Looking backwards, what I can say is looking forward. In the fund that I mentioned here, what we will have, there's maybe a novel strategy in terms of returns, in the sense that we're combining a VC and, let's say, a longer private equity model there. So what we hope to achieve through that product is, on the one side, higher returns from the tech businesses, at maybe longer, maybe slower returns from the place-based businesses. That put together will give us some more reliability and maybe an attractive number. But yeah, we don't have the kind of investment silos to give you a clear answer there.
Thanks. So maybe let's not talk about specific figures. Tina, the discussion around returns and performance, how much is this taking place with your funders? And
yeah, I mean, it's definitely an important topic for us, but not necessarily because we need a return, because we don't. As I said, it's philanthropic capital. So if there is a return, it's reinvested in further impact. So it's not something we need, or we go into an investment and say, we need a 5, 8, or 10% return here. But it's more like the philosophy behind it and what we believe and how we operate. So we do operate and look at the same things that, say, commercially oriented investors or investors that want a return on look at, because we just believe this is the way ventures are going to be most successful, and it's a selection criteria in a way. But it also allows us to be more flexible, because we might invest in something where we know the returns. I mean, as Samir mentioned, you can't compare a venture in our digital solution space with a venture in the education space. It's just not possible. But because we are a foundation, it allows us to do certain investments where we know that returns are very, very hard and take a lot of time. So I think we're in a luxury, in a good and luxurious situation, but yeah, I think I agree with what Zamir said in terms of it's very hard to give numbers here.
Thank you. So we are moving towards the end of the webinar. Now let's also speak about a bit about the institution or the institution type you represent. Even though you share, similar goals of achieving impact, Tina, Elea is a foundation, Zamir, your team is placed in a large NGO. And I know that in the audience we have many people also working for these type of institutions. So maybe first, Zamir, WWF Impact Ventures is relatively new, placed in a large, well-known NGO. Can you share a bit the insights, more practical, when you started, how you got there, also from an internal perspective?
Do you mean the progression to where we are, or?
Yeah, assuming there are people now in NGOs and they think, hey, I really like what Zamir is doing. I'd also like to do that. And what do they need to keep in mind? What are some obstacles, limitations from your experience?
Well, I mean, as I showed before, we've worked in different ways, taking on different roles. So I would have a lot of advice, for organizations in each one of those capacities, in each one of those roles. I did think about it quite a bit before this webinar. I think the first kind of advice I would say is definitely do it. It's not happening enough. They get a lot of attention, these programs, but really there's still not enough activity at the early stage and not enough support at the early stage of these ventures. Very important, I would say, is to swallow the pill, by which I mean fully integrate impact venture or entrepreneurial approaches in the organization. Don't put it as an add-on or make it a silo. It must align with the rest of the work of the foundation. Very important is the time planning. I think to have a long-term plan, to be patient. I think venture capital is not fast. I think that's a misnomer. It actually takes a long time, and I have an anecdote here. I think we've been meeting with, let's say, your traditional VCs or Silicon Valley types now that we're looking at technology. And when they ask about our pathway to sustainability of the ventures, I know the number in my head from experience that we've had. I know the number is 8 years, It takes a minimum of 8 years from a startup to get to financial sustainability. But I lied, I said 6 to 8 years, and then said very quickly it becomes 6, and the guy said that's a nonsense. We have a 10 to 12 year, horizon or time frame for a company. So the reality is, in the traditional spaces, it takes time. So that's very, very important. Very important thing to note. Then I have other points, about really choosing the model carefully, where there's a lot of great work that's happened along lines of acceleration, how to build accelerators, how to measure, their impact. I think if an organization has a specific focus, one thing I would recommend taking a look at is obviously the venture building approach, which really is impressive and a very good way of de-risking a lot of things. I mean, in many cases, we know the problem, we have the data, we know the business models that will work. It's a matter of executing. So I would recommend looking at venture building as a way to do that. And then maybe last point, just to consider organizationally, consider failure. What's an acceptable attrition rate for you? Are you comfortable if 30%, 40% of these ventures don't succeed? Really also consider success. What does that look like? I started my career at the World Bank, where I was working in the evaluation department, and we were always looking at the performance numbers. And under one president, they were hitting 80, 90% satisfactory. And the question is there, can you be doing that well, or are you choosing too easy a path? So those are some of the things that come to mind when thinking about our experience and what others could do in the space.
Thank you, Zamir. Tina, I think these were very valuable points. A lot of foundations are interested in impact investing or models that Elea is doing. we all know that there are some legal restrictions. I'm not sure if it's feasible to talk about them, but also from your experience, can you share some additional things, advices that you want to give to the audience?
Yeah, it's a few things are probably similar to what Zamir said, but I think there's three things. So one is what really helps is having a clear strategy and focus. And I mean, Elea celebrates, I think, the 15th birthday this year. And while we have investing in our 4 topics area for a long time, we still need to learn more. And every investment we make is an additional learning that we can put into practice for a next venture. So the more focused you are, the quicker you learn, and the quicker you can actually apply your expertise and judgment. So that is one thing I think I would say as an advice. Another point is really thinking about measurement and comparability. Also, we have mentioned it before, but I think Elea has, before even starting to invest, really put significant time into building up a measurement framework in order to basically answer a simple question like, if you have on the one hand side an agricultural business like Coffee Circle that sources coffee from thousands of farmers and gives them additional income, how does that compare, on the other hand, to, for example, the vocational training business that completely changes the lives of a beneficiary and gives them access to formal work for his entire life? And I think trying to find a way how to compare those and how to constantly measure and report on your impact is really important. And I think in our case, we also have our measurement framework audited every year externally from BDO. And I also think that is important to really have this quality approval and to really this measurement every year, so you keep to your impact principles. And then finally, it's the patience factor. Not only patience with your investees, because it takes a lot of time. I think when talking about VCs before, I think one essential difference between what we do and what a VC do is not necessarily how we invest, but it's when times get tough, a VC is very different. The VC just writes it off because it's not basically not worth the effort anymore, right? But that's when Elea probably increases or doubles the effort to kind of make it worth and get through the crisis. So I would say that is a bit the difference from us to a VC. I think also it takes time from an organization. I mean, we've been here for 15 years, but it has been a long learning journey. And I think if you're interested in the whole journey itself, our founder, Peter Wufli, together with Vanina Farber, our chair of social innovation at the IMD, they have just launched a book last year in December, where basically they try to kind of write up these learnings and to contribute a bit to that space, in case you really want to go and dig into the details.
Thank you so much, Tina. I would suggest that we stop here. I think it was a very insightful discussion and also presentation. Thank you so much, Tina, Alejandra, and Zamir, for your participation. We will make sure to share the presentation after the webinar, also with the contact details of our panelists. So if people in the audience are interested, as Zamir said, of really going into it and doing such models, then you know how to contact them. We would like to thank you for attending this webinar and stay tuned for future events of iGravity on the exciting world of innovative finance. Thanks a lot and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.